Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Tiffany, a retired librarian turned homeschool mom, and in this video I'm going to start my classics book reviews. So we're going to look at L. Frank Baum's The Wizard of Oz series. Now, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was published in 1900. This was the first book that was actually originally supposed to be a standalone book. So, and yes, that is kind of important, particularly when you get to the marvelous land of Oz, which is, and a few other books where he retcons and some of the stuff that he says. So this is the story. I think more people are familiar with the Judy Garland film, and most people have seen that. I will cover that. It's very different in certain things. The basic story is kind of the same. You have a little girl who's, in the books, Dorothy's probably closer to 10 because she mentions that she's around 4 feet tall. So she's still pretty young. She lives with her aunt and uncle, who are very solemn people. They live in Kansas. It happens really quickly. You're literally in Kansas, brief description, like a half a page, if that, before a tornado whaps them and throws them off to Oz, which is a real place. She lands on a witch dies, the Munchkins, who had been enslaved by the witch, come out along with the Good Witch of the North. That is not Glenda. Cannot remember her name. I'm not even sure it's mentioned. She takes silver shoes off this witch, hands them to Dorothy, and kisses her on the forehead, giving her protection without fully explaining what the heck is going on, and then sends her on her way. So she travels down a big road. She runs into the Scarecrow, the Tin Woodsman, whose backstory is very dark. He was a real person by the name of, I believe it's Nick Copper. So that was his real name. He does start going by it in later books. But he wanted to marry a Munchkin woman, I believe the Wicked Witch, he's not really clear, curses his axe, and he slowly hacks himself to death, turning his different body parts into tin. Yes, this book gets very dark, but it was very, very popular, and when it came out, which is the reason there's a dozen more, kids kept begging Baum to write them, and they kept making him money, so he kept writing them. So you meet the Cowardly Lion, which is an actual lion. They go through various adventures trying to get to the wizard. They get to the wizard, and he basically sends them to kill this other witch. So they go to the other witch. She sees the lion, wants to use the lion as a slave to run her chariot. She doesn't care about anybody else. Yes, and that includes Dorothy. So she sends first wolves, which are killed by the Tin Woodsman, crows, which are killed by the Scarecrow, and then she uses a final wish on a hat which summons the flying monkeys, who throw the Tin Woodsman on rocks, tear apart the Scarecrow, and then because of that protection from the Good Witch of the North, they can't do anything to Dorothy. So they kidnap her and the lion. The lion's imprisoned. The witch realizes Dorothy has no idea how powerful her shoes are, or that the witch can't actually hurt her because of the kiss on her forehead. So she enslaves her. And this goes on for a while. She's been enslaved by this witch. But the witch wants the shoes. And Dorothy never takes off her shoes. So the witch trips her, grabs one of her shoes. Dorothy, in order to get her shoe back, throws water on the witch. Witch melts. The Winkies, which are the creatures that this witch has enslaved, help them get their friends back together. They eventually use the flying monkeys, because Dorothy takes the hat, to get them back to Oz. Oz reveals himself as a humbug, as Dorothy calls him. He was a man who was part of the circus. He was up announcing the circus in the hot air balloon. That's how he ended up in Oz. So he uses some trickery to get the Scarecrow some brains, the lion some courage, and the Tin Woodsman his heart. And then they try to use the flying monkeys again to try to get Dorothy over the desert which surrounds Oz. But they can't do that, so they end up going off a few more adventures, including a giant spider and some various dolls made of the porcelain that are walking around and can in fact still break and then glue themselves together. It's very, very weird. Again, this was very popular in 1900. They get to Glenda, who's the Good Witch of the South. She tells Dorothy what to do with the shoes, how to get home, and then uses the hat with the flying monkeys to get her other friends back to their new ruling kingdoms. Scarecrow goes back to the Emerald City, and he's the ruler there. The Winkies invite the Tin Woodsman to rule them, and then the lion who would rescue these jungle creatures from a giant spider, he goes and rules over them. And that's essentially the end of the story. Now, there's one thing that has always struck me, that you always hear Dorothy desperately wanting to get home. Nobody quite understands why, because her aunt and uncle are very solemn people. Kansas is very boring. Well, she mentions her uncle not being able to afford mourning clothes for her aunt. So if you know anything about Victorian death customs, you'll realize that it is expected women to wear black, which was an expensive fabric. It was expensive to dye clothing black for a certain period of time. And just kind of my understanding is Dorothy, pretty much being her Auntie M's almost adopted daughter, her aunt could have been wearing all black for anywhere from 6 months to a year. So it would have been too expensive. And she mentions that at the end. And she also loves her aunt and uncle. You kind of see that throughout the other books. So that's why she wants to get back to them. And again, as opposed to the film, her adventures really did happen. Oz is a real place in the story. So we're going to move on to the marvelous Land of Oz, which came out in 1904. This story, actually, Dorothy's not involved at all. This involves a little boy by the name of Tip, who's kind of been raised and almost enslaved by a witch called Mombi in the land of the Good Witch of the North, who, again, old lady, not much power. So she's going to turn him into stone. And she'd also gotten a magic bring to life powder, where he had created a kind of a jack-o'-lantern person to scare her. Well, they bring him to life, and you have Jack Pumpkinhead, and then he uses the same powder of life to bring to life a sawhorse. They run into a magnified bug, go to the Land of Oz, go to the, not Land of Oz, the center of Oz, the Emerald City, where the Scarecrow, who is in charge, is chased out by a bunch of very unhappy young ladies who don't want to be housewives. So they, various other adventurers, bring in the Tin Woodsman, eventually get to Glinda, who says, well, Scarecrow's not really supposed to be king. There was this little girl that Mombi was involved with and Oz tried to get rid of. So they go on adventures trying to, where the heck is she? Turns out she's Tip. Yeah, Mombi turned a little baby girl into a little boy. So they eventually get Mombi. Mombi eventually is forced to tell the truth, and then they use magic to turn a rather reluctant Tip back into Princess Ozma. And this book was written in 1904, so the whole trends thing probably wasn't all that common. And again, these were written for children, so there was a whole magical thing. So then we have Ozma of Oz. This is a different story. If you are familiar, a lot of people think of this as a horror movie, but the Return to Oz film kind of takes a few things from the previous book, which is about Tip here, the Marvelous Land of Oz, but mostly the story is from Ozma of Oz. So Dorothy, in this case, her uncle's stressed out, so they're sending him to Australia, and he enjoys her, so she's with him, is knocked overboard on this ship in the ocean with a chicken coop and a hen named Bill, recalled Bellina. And they go on an adventure through a different land called Ev, and with the help of Ozma and the Tin Woodsman and the Scarecrow and all her other friends, including Jack Pumpkinhead, try to rescue this queen and her children whose husband had sold them to the Gnome King for a long life and then committed suicide. Yes, again, 1907, these things are dark. So that's the kind of the adventure. These families have been turned to baubles, and they have to turn them back. And in this case, Bellina helps them by, unbeknownst to them, spying on the Gnome King and figuring this out. And they rescue them, and they fight the Gnome King. And again, it's kind of like most of these stories. It's a tale of meandering adventures. So it's a very interesting story. In the film, they give the Gnome King the ruby slippers, which, paying attention to the first book, they're not ruby, they're silver shoes in the original book. And the Gnome King actually has a magic belt, and they get a hold of that and kind of escape that way. So it's an interesting story. Again, similar to the Wizard of Oz, Marvelous Land of Oz, it's very good to read aloud, but these things can get very dark. If your kid scares early or easily, don't read these books. I mean, these things get very dark, and then they get very, very weird. The fourth book, which I have read, which is Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. This is interesting. So Dorothy's gotten back from Australia. She'd been staying with friends in further Southern California. They're coming up toward the San Francisco area where her uncle's been visiting friends. She's picked up by a little boy, I think it was Zeb, and his horse, Jim. And then an earthquake happens, and they end up in the center of the planet with, of course, she also has a cat by the name of Eureka. So Toto is not here. I believe he's still in Kansas. And the wizard shows up. He has been back to his old job advertising the circus. Again, earthquake happens and they end up underground. This gets odd because the land they enter in the middle of the planet, they first interact with plants that basically consider them meat and try to kill them. Yeah, and I believe they deal with gargoyles, and it's a meandering story before getting back to Oz and Princess Ozma, where then the little kitten is put on trial for nearly killing one of these tiny little pigs that the wizard has gifted Ozma. So yes, they put a kitten on trial and they were going to execute her. So yeah, again, these things get odd. Now, the last book I've kind of gotten into, which is book 5, which is The Road to Oz, which is going to surround Toto, which is what I've read. I've pretty much, again, it's meandering, so it started to get a little bit boring, so I've stopped reading it recently. So Dorothy's run into a shaggy man. You have Toto who is involved, and they're wandering down this road. That's as far as I've gotten. Now, this is my advice when it comes to these books. They are good to read aloud if you have kids who have the patience for it. So more chapter by chapter kind of thing. If your kids scare easy, don't. These things get dark, they get creepy, they get very, very weird. Again, Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz has plants that want to eat you or kill you and bury you, and it's very strange. It's very, very strange. Mind you, that's also the book where they retcon on a few things from book 2. Now the wizard has absolutely nothing to do with selling off Ozma, and he knew nothing about her, and you get a whole backstory of how there was the witches and things. So this was something, again, Baum didn't intend this to be such a long series. So they were popular, they made money, he needed money, he was married, he had kids. So now I haven't read to the Road of Oz. That came out in 1909. The Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz came out in 1908. The rest of the books, you have The Emerald City of Oz, that came out in 1910, and The Patchwork Girl of Oz came out in 1913. Now, The Emerald City of Oz was apparently supposed to be the last book, so he intended to stop writing them. But then, I'm guessing money and people were begging for it, so he wrote The Patchwork Girl of Oz in 1913, TikTok of Oz in 1914, The Scarecrow of Oz in 1915, and then you have Rink Tink Tink of Oz in 1916, The Lost Princess of Oz in 1917, and The Tin Woodsman of Oz in 1918, and The Magic of Oz in 1919. So this is actually one of the last books written by Baum himself, because Baum, I believe, died right around 1919. So this was his last book, and then looks like you have Glenda of Oz, which was published a year later. That was written entirely, it wasn't written entirely by Baum, and was published after his death. So that is the Wizard of Oz series. Like I said, I've gotten to the Road of Oz and kind of looked at it, but for me, it's personally started to get boring. I may try to read some of these books to my kids later. But that's kind of a summary of this series. Again, this is written at the turn of the century, so they can get very dark just because the kids were used to that kind of thing. So if your kids really love adventure stories, are interested in that kind of thing, they'd be great read aloud books. If you have older kids and are they're interested in studying this time in history, they're a good book to look at kind of what kids were interested at that time, because they were popular. That's the reason he wrote so many. And then people took over and wrote more of them. There's quite a few Oz books. So it's a good way to look into that period of a window into history, because again, they were popular at the time. So you're going to find themes and things that kids would have enjoyed back at this time. So they're good books. They can get very dark. They can also, at least in my opinion, kind of get meandering and a little boring at times. So your kids really do have to have the patience for them. And you have to have the patience for them, because a lot of times you may be reading them, or the older kids may be reading them. And they have to kind of have the patience to kind of get through these type of adventure stories. They are, like I said, they're good stories. They're a good window into the past, because they were written at a time. And L. Frank Baum was a decent human being. There is a little bit of background him being against Native Americans. Not really uncommon at the time. And again, these books are no longer in copyright. Baum died in 1919. So I don't know if his family is even involved in the Oz universe at all, particularly since, like I said, it's out of copyright and has been for some time. So that's my basic review of the Wizard of Oz books. I will do another review kind of looking at the film and probably touching on the Return to Oz as well, just because these are the only closest thing we have to direct adaptations of these books. And the Wonderful Wizard of Oz with Judy Garland, yeah, that's a story in human rights violations. Those people were treated like crap. But we will get to that. So if you enjoy this review, want to see more, I will be covering the film a little bit. I will also, my next thing on my list is actually to do the Anne of Green Gables books. So thank you. Like and subscribe again if you like this review. Thank you. And I will hopefully see you again with the Anne of Avonlea.